Margaret Williams pushed her cleaning cart through the marble halls of Pinnacle Industries. Her simple uniform and quiet demeanor making her nearly invisible to the executives rushing past. What they didn't know was that this humble cleaning lady held the power to change everything. When the arrogant CEO, Marcus Bradford, decided to publicly humiliate her in front of the entire board of directors, he had no idea he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. They had no idea who she really was. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Margaret Williams stepped off the city bus at exactly 5:30 in the morning, her worn canvas shoes making soft sounds against the pristine sidewalk leading to the towering glass structure of Pinnacle Industries. She carried a small brown bag containing her simple lunch and wore the same navy blue cleaning uniform she had worn for the past 3 months. Its fabric soft from countless washings but still clean and pressed with care. Her graying hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her kind eyes held a wisdom that seemed to take in everything around her with quiet intensity. As she entered through the employee entrance, swiping her badge with practiced efficiency, Margaret moved through the marble-lined corridors like a ghost, her presence barely registering to the early arriving executives who rushed past her with their expensive briefcases and designer coffee cups. She had learned to become invisible in this world of power suits and corner offices. Watching as junior analysts hurried past without making eye contact, their minds already consumed with spreadsheets and quarterly projections, Margaret pushed her cleaning cart methodically through each floor. Her movements deliberate and unhurried, but her sharp mind was constantly processing the conversations she overheard, the casual dismissals of employees by their superiors, and the way certain executives treated anyone they perceived as beneath their status. She noticed how the senior partners spoke differently when they thought only other executives were listening, their voices taking on a harder edge, their comments revealing attitudes that would never surface in their carefully crafted public personas. When she cleaned the conference rooms, Margaret observed the remnants of their meetings, the discarded notes and abandoned presentations that told stories of corporate decisions made without consideration for the human cost. She watched as security guards were berated for minor infractions, as administrative assistants were ignored when they tried to contribute valuable insights, and as maintenance workers were treated like furniture rather than human beings with families and dreams of their own. Each interaction was filed away in her remarkable memory, each slight and kindness catalogued with the precision of someone who understood that true character was revealed not in boardroom presentations, but in the quiet moments when people believed no one important was watching. Marcus Bradford strode through the executive floor of Pinnacle Industries, like a king surveying his kingdom. His handcrafted Italian leather shoes clicking authoritatively against the polished marble with each measured step. His tailored charcoal suit, worth more than most employees made in a month, fit his tall frame perfectly, and his signature silk tie in deep burgundy had become his trademark among the corporate elite who competed for his attention and approval. At 45, Marcus had climbed the corporate ladder with ruthless efficiency, stepping on anyone he deemed unworthy of his time or respect, and his corner office with its panoramic city view served as a monument to his belief that success meant looking down on others from the highest possible perch. He had cultivated an image of sophistication and superiority that he wielded like a weapon, using his sharp tongue and condescending smile to remind everyone around him of their place in the carefully constructed hierarchy he ruled with an iron fist. When he passed through the hallways, administrative assistants would lower their eyes and quicken their pace, knowing that any perceived slight or inefficiency could result in a public dressing down that would leave them humiliated and scrambling to save their careers. Marcus took particular pleasure in correcting what he considered to be breaches of protocol, whether it was a security guard who dared to make eye contact for too long or a maintenance worker who had the audacity to use the executive elevator during peak hours. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never been challenged in his position of power, each word carefully enunciated to emphasize the vast gulf he believed existed between himself and those he considered beneath his station. The board of directors had grown accustomed to his demanding presence and his insistence that every detail of corporate life reflect the exclusivity and prestige he believed Pinnacle Industries represented. and Marcus had surrounded himself with sycophants who reinforced his conviction that his success was a result of his inherent superiority rather than the fortunate circumstances and family connections that had actually paved his path to the executive suite. He viewed the building as his personal domain, where every employee from the mailroom to middle management existed solely to serve his vision of corporate excellence, and anyone who failed to recognize their subordinate role would quickly find themselves reminded of the natural order that placed Marcus Bradford at the apex of professional achievement. Margaret's daily routine began each morning in the break room on the third floor, where she would quietly prepare her cleaning supplies while the early shift of junior analysts and entry-level employees trickled in for their coffee and hurried breakfast. Unlike the senior executives who moved through the building as if she were part of the furniture, these younger workers would offer her genuine smiles and warm greetings that brightened her morning and reminded her that kindness still existed within these corporate walls. Sarah Chen, a recent college graduate working in the accounting department, would always pause to ask about Margaret's weekend and share stories about her own family, treating her with the same respect she showed her supervisors. While David Martinez from the IT support team would often help Margaret move heavy equipment or reach high shelves without being asked, his natural courtesy a stark contrast to the entitled behavior she witnessed from the upper floors. These interactions filled Margaret with hope as she watched these young professionals navigate their careers with integrity and compassion, maintaining their humanity despite the pressure to conform to the cold corporate culture that surrounded them. However, as Margaret moved to the executive floors throughout her day, the atmosphere changed dramatically, and she became acutely aware of how invisible she was to the senior management team, who walked past her as if she existed in a completely different dimension. Vice presidents would hold confidential conversations directly in front of her, discussing sensitive company matters with the assumption that a cleaning lady posed no threat to their carefully guarded secrets, while department heads would interrupt her work without apology, demanding that she move her supplies so they could use conference rooms for impromptu meetings that they considered far more important than her scheduled duties. Margaret observed how these same executives who ignored her existence would transform their demeanor completely when greeting each other, their voices becoming animated and their body language shifting to display the false camaraderie that defined their professional relationships. She noticed the way they would step around her cart without acknowledgement, as if it were an obstacle rather than the workplace of a human being, and how they would discuss layoffs and budget cuts within her earshot, never considering that she might understand the implications of their decisions or care about the colleagues whose livelihoods hung in the balance. These daily contrasts reinforced Margaret's growing understanding of the toxic hierarchy that Marcus Bradford had cultivated, where respect was reserved only for those deemed worthy by title and salary, while the essential workers who kept the company functioning were treated as expendable and invisible components of the corporate machine. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning, when Margaret was emptying wastebaskets in the executive conference room, her movements slow and deliberate as she processed the urgent whispers and hushed phone calls that had begun echoing through the hallways of Pinnacle Industries like a gathering storm. Marcus Bradford had called an emergency board meeting for Friday afternoon, and the tension in the air was so thick that even the usually oblivious senior executives seemed to move with a new sense of urgency and barely concealed anxiety. Margaret overheard fragments of conversations as she dusted the mahogany conference table where the fate of the company would be decided, catching references to quarterly projections that had fallen short of expectations, investor concerns that were growing more vocal by the day, and whispered speculation about potential restructuring that could affect hundreds of jobs throughout the organization. As she cleaned the windows that overlooked the bustling city below, Margaret listened to Marcus pacing in his office next door, his voice carrying through the thin walls as he barked orders to his assistant about preparing presentations that would demonstrate his leadership capabilities and justify the controversial decisions he had made over the past year. The junior employees who had always treated her with kindness now wore worried expressions as they huddled around their desks, discussing rumors of impending layoffs and department closures that could destroy the careers they had worked so hard to build, while the senior executives seemed more concerned with positioning themselves favorably for whatever changes Marcus might announce during the critical meeting. Margaret continued her duties with the same quiet efficiency she had maintained for months. but her sharp mind was cataloging every piece of information she gathered, every careless comment made in her presence, and every indication that this board meeting would serve as Marcus Bradford's attempt to consolidate his power while sacrificing the livelihoods of the dedicated employees who had made Pinnacle Industries successful. She noticed how Marcus had begun scheduling private meetings with individual board members. His charm, offensive, designed to ensure their support for whatever drastic measures he planned to propose, and she observed the way he dismissed concerns from department heads who tried to advocate for their teams, his arrogance preventing him from recognizing that his leadership style had created the very problems he now claimed to be solving. The building hummed with anticipation and dread as Friday approached, and Margaret knew that this meeting would be the catalyst that would finally force her to reveal the truth about who she really was and why she had been watching from the shadows for so long. The first direct encounter between Marcus Bradford and Margaret Williams occurred on Wednesday afternoon when she was meticulously polishing the brass fixtures outside the executive boardroom, showing her quiet efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaos of last-minute preparations happening around her. As Marcus emerged from his corner office with an armload of financial reports and a scowl that suggested his day had not proceeding according to his carefully orchestrated plans. He paused mid-stride when he noticed Margaret working near the entrance to what he considered his personal domain, his eyes narrowing as he took in her simple uniform and the methodical way she attended to her duties without acknowledging his presence or stepping aside to make way for his obviously more important business. Marcus cleared his throat loudly, expecting immediate deference, but when Margaret simply continued her work with the same steady rhythm, he felt a flicker of irritation that someone so far beneath his station would dare to ignore his implicit demand for recognition and submission. He adjusted his signature burgundy tie with a sharp tug, a gesture that had become his trademark signal of displeasure, and spoke in a voice loud enough for the passing executives to hear, ensuring that his comment would serve as both a put-down and a demonstration of his authority to anyone within earshot. The help around here seems to have forgotten that some areas require a higher level of discretion, he remarked to his assistant, who had hurried to catch up with his brisk pace, his tone dripping with the kind of casual condescension that had become second nature after years of treating support staff as invisible obstacles to his important work. Margaret looked up briefly, her kind eyes meeting his cold stare for just a moment. But she said nothing and returned to her task with the same dignity she had maintained throughout her months of observation, her silence somehow more powerful than any response she could have offered to his petty attempt at establishing dominance. Marcus felt oddly unsettled by her lack of reaction, having grown accustomed to the immediate apologies and nervous scrambling that usually followed his pointed remarks. But he dismissed the feeling and continued toward the boardroom while muttering something about maintaining proper standards and ensuring that certain people understood the boundaries of their position within the corporate hierarchy. His assistant nodded enthusiastically, though her discomfort was evident, as she glanced back at Margaret with an apologetic expression that suggested she understood the injustice of the situation, but lacked the courage to challenge her boss's behavior, leaving Margaret to finish her work in the heavy silence that followed Marcus's calculated display of superiority. The opportunity to reveal her business acumen came unexpectedly on Thursday morning when Margaret was cleaning the small conference room adjacent to Marcus Bradford's office, her presence so thoroughly ignored that the three senior vice presidents had begun discussing their most pressing concerns about tomorrow's board meeting as if she were simply another piece of furniture in the elegantly appointed space. She listened intently while dusting the bookshelf as they debated the company's declining market share in the Southeast region, their voices growing increasingly frustrated as they cycled through the same failed strategies that had been implemented over the past 18 months without success, each executive offering variations of the same conventional wisdom that had already proven ineffective in reversing Pinnacle Industries' downward trajectory. Vice President Reynolds was insisting that increased advertising expenditure would solve their regional problems, while Vice President Hamilton argued for aggressive price cuts that would inevitably damage their profit margins, and Vice President Chen suggested expanding their sales force despite the obvious budget constraints that made such expansion financially impossible in the current economic climate. Margaret continued her methodical cleaning, but as she moved closer to empty the wastebasket near their table, she found herself quietly clearing her throat. and speaking in her gentle, respectful tone that had become familiar to the few employees who bothered to acknowledge her existence. "Excuse me," she said softly, not wanting to interrupt but feeling compelled to offer the insight that had crystallized in her mind as she listened to their circular discussion. "But have you considered that your distribution partnership with Morrison Logistics might be limiting your reach in those markets, especially since they lost their exclusive contract with the major retail chains last quarter and are now routing most Southeast deliveries through their less efficient secondary network?" The three executives paused their conversation and turned to stare at her with expressions of bewilderment and barely concealed annoyance, as if a piece of office equipment had suddenly begun offering unsolicited business advice. And after a moment of uncomfortable silence, Vice President Reynolds dismissed her observation with a condescending wave of his hand, suggesting that she focus on her cleaning duties and leave the strategic thinking to people who actually understood the complexities of corporate operations. Margaret nodded politely and returned to her work, but she noticed Vice President Chen quietly jotting down notes about Morrison Logistics on her tablet, and she wondered if any of them would later investigate her suggestion and discover that she had identified the exact problem that had been undermining their Southeast expansion for over a year, though she doubted they would ever connect their eventual solution back to the humble cleaning lady who had handed them the key to unlocking their regional challenges. As Friday morning arrived with the weight of anticipation that had been building throughout the week, Marcus Bradford found himself becoming increasingly agitated by Margaret Williams' continued presence in areas he considered exclusively reserved for corporate leadership, and his irritation grew more pronounced with each encounter as she went about her cleaning duties with the same quiet dignity that seemed to mock his attempts to establish clear boundaries between the executive class and the support staff he believed should remain invisible. During the pre-board meeting strategy session in the main conference room, Marcus made several pointed comments about the need for privacy and discretion, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled frustration as he watched Margaret methodically clean the windows, while he and his team discussed sensitive financial projections and restructuring plans that he insisted required absolute confidentiality. His agitation became so obvious that Senior Vice President Thompson quietly suggested they might want to reschedule Margaret's cleaning for after their meeting. But Marcus waved off the suggestion with a dismissive gesture, declaring that certain people needed to learn their place and understand when their services were not required in spaces designated for important business decisions. The other executives exchanged uncomfortable glances as Marcus's hostility toward the cleaning lady became impossible to ignore, particularly when he began speaking louder and more aggressively whenever Margaret was within earshot. His comments about maintaining professional standards and ensuring proper hierarchy clearly directed at her continued presence rather than any legitimate business concern. Vice President Hamilton, who had always prided himself on treating all employees with basic respect, found himself increasingly disturbed by his CEO's behavior, especially when Marcus began making subtle but pointed remarks about people who failed to recognize their station and the importance of knowing when to make themselves scarce during executive discussions. Margaret continued her work with unshakable composure, her calm demeanor serving as a stark contrast to Marcus's growing agitation, and her refusal to be intimidated or hurried seemed to fuel his anger in ways that even his closest advisors found deeply uncomfortable to witness. The tension in the room became palpable as other executives began to realize that their respected CEO was engaging in what appeared to be a petty power struggle with a member of the cleaning staff, and several began to question whether Marcus's stress about the upcoming board meeting was causing him to lose his professional composure in ways that could damage his reputation and credibility with the very people whose support he desperately needed. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of electric anticipation that transforms ordinary corporate spaces into stages for career-defining moments, and the executive boardroom of Pinnacle Industries had been transformed into an arena where Marcus Bradford would either cement his leadership or face the consequences of months of declining performance and questionable decisions. Margaret Williams moved through the mahogany-paneled room with her usual methodical precision, ensuring that every surface gleamed and every detail met the exacting standards that such an important gathering demanded. Her presence, a quiet constant as board members began filing through the heavy oak doors with their leather portfolios and grave expressions that suggested they understood the gravity of the decisions they would make in the next few hours. The 12-person board represented decades of combined business experience and millions of dollars in shareholder interests. And as they took their seats around the polished conference table, Margaret continued her final preparations, checking that water glasses were properly positioned and that the presentation materials were arranged with the kind of attention to detail that had made her invaluable to the smooth operation of executive functions throughout her months at Pinnacle Industries. Marcus Bradford entered the room like a storm system, his expensive suit impeccably tailored, but his demeanor betraying the stress and anxiety that had been building as he prepared for this crucial presentation. And the moment his eyes fell on Margaret's quiet form arranging materials at the far end of the room, his carefully constructed facade began to crack with visible irritation. He had specifically requested that all non-essential personnel be excluded from the boardroom during this meeting, and the sight of the cleaning lady continuing her duties while board members settled into their seats struck him as a direct challenge to his authority and a breach of the protocol he had worked so hard to establish during his tenure as chief executive. His jaw tightened as he watched her move with unhurried efficiency, her calm presence somehow making his own agitation more pronounced, and he could feel his temper rising as she seemed completely oblivious to the importance of the gathering and the need for absolute privacy during discussions that would shape the future of the entire organization. Board Chairman Elizabeth Morrison noticed Marcus's obvious distraction and followed his gaze to where Margaret was quietly finishing her tasks. But before she could address the situation diplomatically, Marcus's frustration finally reached the breaking point that had been building throughout the week of increasingly tense encounters with the woman who had somehow become the symbol of everything he felt was wrong with the lack of proper deference and hierarchy within his corporate domain. Marcus Bradford's voice cut through the dignified silence of the boardroom like a blade, his carefully cultivated professional demeanor finally giving way to the raw arrogance and prejudice that had been simmering beneath his polished exterior for months. And he addressed Margaret with a tone so sharp and condescending that several board members immediately shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. "Excuse me," he began with false politeness that quickly evaporated into open hostility, "but I believe I made it clear that this meeting requires absolute privacy and that certain people should not be present when serious business is being conducted by serious professionals." Margaret looked up from her quiet work with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout their previous encounters. But Marcus interpreted her silence as defiance rather than professionalism, and his voice grew louder and more aggressive as he continued his public attack in front of the most powerful people in the company. "I'm not sure what part of discretion and proper boundaries you fail to understand," he continued, his words dripping with contempt as he gestured dismissively toward her simple uniform and modest appearance. "But perhaps someone needs to explain to you that there are certain spaces in this building where people like you simply don't belong, especially when important decisions are being made by individuals who actually understand the complexities of running a successful business." The board members watched in stunned silence as their respected CEO transformed into something ugly and cruel, his mask of sophistication slipping completely as he continued his verbal assault on a woman who had done nothing more than perform her assigned duties with quiet competence and unwavering professionalism. "Do you have any idea how inappropriate your presence is right now?" he demanded, his voice rising to ensure that everyone in the room could hear his demonstration of power and authority. "Or are you simply too limited in your understanding to recognize when you're disrupting matters that are far beyond your comprehension and capability?" Board Chairman Elizabeth Morrison began to rise from her seat with a look of alarm, clearly recognizing that Marcus had crossed a line that no professional leader should ever cross, but he was too consumed with his need to assert dominance to notice the shock and disapproval spreading across the faces of the people whose respect and support he desperately needed to maintain his position at the head of Pinnacle Industries. Marcus Bradford's anger reached a fever pitch as he realized that Margaret had not immediately scrambled to gather her supplies and flee from his verbal assault, and her continued composed presence in the face of his public humiliation seemed to inflame his rage to levels that shocked even the most seasoned board members who had witnessed countless corporate confrontations throughout their distinguished careers. "This is completely unacceptable," he declared with the kind of imperious authority that brooked no argument, his finger pointing accusingly at Margaret as if she were a criminal who had invaded sacred ground rather than a dedicated employee performing her assigned duties with quiet professionalism. "I want her removed from this building immediately," he continued, his voice echoing off the mahogany-paneled walls with such vehemence that several board members instinctively recoiled from the naked hostility that had transformed their respected CEO into something unrecognizable and deeply disturbing. "She is disrupting the most important business meeting this company has conducted in years, and I will not tolerate having someone of her obvious limitations contaminating discussions that require the highest levels of intelligence and strategic thinking that are clearly beyond her capacity to understand or appreciate." Margaret stood quietly beside her cleaning cart, her hands folded peacefully in front of her simple uniform, her kind eyes reflecting a depth of wisdom and strength that seemed to grow more pronounced with each cruel word that Marcus hurled in her direction, and her refusal to be broken or diminished by his attack only seemed to fuel his determination to assert his dominance through increasingly vicious and personal attacks. "People like her need to understand their place in the natural order of business," he continued with the kind of casual cruelty that revealed the true nature of his character. "And that place is certainly not in the same room where decisions affecting millions of dollars and thousands of jobs are being made by individuals who have earned the right to be here through education, experience, and demonstrated capability." Board Chairman Elizabeth Morrison finally found her voice and began to speak, but Marcus cut her off with an angry gesture that demonstrated his complete loss of professional control, his face flushed with the kind of righteous indignation that he believed justified his treatment of someone he considered so far beneath his station that her very presence constituted an insult to his authority and the dignity of corporate leadership that he had spent years cultivating and protecting from contamination by the inferior classes who served at his pleasure. Margaret Williams lifted her chin slightly and met Marcus Bradford's furious gaze with the kind of quiet strength that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within her soul, her voice carrying a calm authority that cut through his verbal assault like a gentle but unshakable force of nature as she spoke words that would forever change the trajectory of his arrogant assumption of power and control. "I have every right to be here," she said with such serene confidence that the entire boardroom fell into stunned silence, her simple statement carrying the weight of absolute truth that made Marcus's face flush an even deeper shade of red as he processed the audacity of someone he considered beneath contempt, daring to challenge his explicit commands and public humiliation. "I will not be leaving," she continued, with the same measured tone that had remained steady throughout his increasingly vicious attack, her dignified refusal to be intimidated, serving as a mirror that reflected back the ugly reality of what Marcus Bradford had become in his desperate attempt to maintain dominance over someone he had fundamentally misjudged and underestimated. Marcus felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crack at the foundation, as this humble cleaning lady refused to bow to his authority, and his response revealed the depths of his character as he abandoned any pretense of professional behavior and allowed his true nature to surface in ways that horrified the distinguished board members who were witnessing the complete destruction of his reputation. "You insolent woman!" he snarled with the kind of venom that exposed decades of ingrained prejudice and superiority complex. "Your kind always thinks you can push boundaries and challenge your betters, but I will make sure you never work in this city again. And everyone will know exactly what happens when people forget their place and try to rise above their natural station in life." The racist undertones in his words hung in the air like poison, making board members shift uncomfortably as they realized they were witnessing not just unprofessional behavior, but the exposure of beliefs that had no place in modern corporate leadership, while Margaret continued to stand with unshakable dignity that seemed to grow stronger with each word he spoke against her. "Your employment here is terminated effective immediately," Marcus continued with the kind of vindictive pleasure that came from believing he held absolute power over someone's livelihood and future. "And I will personally ensure that your obvious inability to respect authority and understand appropriate boundaries follows you wherever you try to find work among people who value proper hierarchy and natural order." The boardroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Margaret Williams slowly and deliberately removed her cleaning gloves, the simple latex materials that had served as symbols of her assumed station falling to the polished mahogany table with a soft sound that seemed to echo through the tension-filled silence like the opening notes of a symphony that would forever change the lives of everyone present in this moment of corporate reckoning. Her movements were unhurried and purposeful as she set down her spray bottle and cleaning cloth with the same methodical precision she had brought to every task during her months of careful observation. But now each gesture carried the weight of revelation and transformation that made even the most experienced board members lean forward in their leather chairs with growing anticipation and unease. Marcus Bradford watched her deliberate actions with a mixture of confusion and mounting rage, his mind unable to process why this woman he had spent the last several minutes systematically destroying would respond to his threats and humiliation with such calm ceremony, rather than the tears and desperate apologies he had expected from someone whose livelihood he believed he had just obliterated with his display of executive power. Board Chairman Elizabeth Morrison found herself studying Margaret's face with new intensity, recognizing something in the woman's composed demeanor that suggested depths of strength and intelligence that had somehow remained hidden beneath the surface of her humble exterior. While Senior Vice President Thompson quietly reached for his phone, as if sensing that whatever was about to unfold might require documentation or immediate action to protect the company's interests, the other board members sat in uncomfortable silence, their own complicity in allowing Marcus's verbal assault to continue weighing heavily on their consciences as they realized they were witnessing a moment that would define not only their CEO's career but their own moral standing as leaders who had failed to intervene when basic human decency demanded action. Margaret's hands were now free of the tools that had defined her role in Marcus's narrow understanding of corporate hierarchy, and as she straightened to her full height with the kind of dignity that seemed to fill the entire room with an almost electric sense of anticipation, every person present understood instinctively that they were about to witness something extraordinary that would shatter their assumptions and forever alter the balance of power that Marcus Bradford had believed was his birthright to wield without challenge or consequence. Margaret Williams moved with the kind of serene confidence that transforms ordinary moments into history, her steps deliberate and unhurried as she walked the length of the polished mahogany conference table that had served as the center of corporate power for Pinnacle Industries since the company's founding 3 decades earlier, and every board member watched in stunned fascination as this woman they had barely noticed suddenly commanded the attention of the entire room with nothing more than her quiet dignity and unshakable sense of purpose. She approached the ornate leather chair that sat at the head of the table like a throne, the seat that Marcus Bradford had occupied with such arrogant certainty for the past 4 years, and without a word of explanation or a moment of hesitation, she pulled back the chair and settled herself into the position of ultimate authority with the kind of natural grace that suggested she belonged there far more than the man who had just spent the last 10 minutes attempting to destroy her character and livelihood. The silence that followed her bold action was deafening, broken only by the sound of Marcus Bradford's sharp intake of breath as his brain struggled to process what he was witnessing, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something approaching panic as he realized that his carefully orchestrated board meeting had been completely derailed by the actions of someone he had dismissed as beneath his notice or concern. "Security!" he shouted, with the kind of desperate authority that comes from a man who feels his power slipping away like sand through his fingers, his voice cracking slightly as he pointed an accusatory finger at Margaret, while his other hand fumbled for his phone to call for reinforcements against this unprecedented challenge to his leadership. "I want this woman arrested for trespassing and removed from this building immediately," he continued with escalating hysteria, his professional composure completely shattered as he faced the impossible reality that a cleaning lady had not only defied his orders but had taken his seat at the head of his own boardroom table with the kind of calm assurance that suggested she had every right to be exactly where she was sitting. Board Chairman Elizabeth Morrison held up a restraining hand toward Marcus, while never taking her eyes off Margaret, her experienced instincts as a corporate leader telling her that something far more significant than a mental breakdown was unfolding before their eyes, and she spoke in a measured tone that cut through Marcus's panic with the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating corporate crises and recognizing when the fundamental assumptions underlying their entire understanding of a situation were about to be completely overturned. Margaret Williams looked around the boardroom with the same calm eyes that had observed months of corporate behavior from her position of deliberate invisibility, but now her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had finally decided to claim her rightful place at the center of power. And when she spoke, her words fell like thunder in the stunned silence that had enveloped the most important people in Pinnacle Industries. "My name is Margaret Elizabeth Williams, and I am the majority shareholder of this company, holding 51% of all outstanding shares through the Williams Family Trust that was established by my father when he founded Pinnacle Industries 32 years ago." She announced with a kind of quiet strength that made every person in the room lean forward in their chairs as the impossible became undeniably real before their disbelieving eyes. "For the past 3 months, I have been working undercover as a member of the cleaning staff to assess the true culture and leadership of the company that bears my family's legacy. And what I have witnessed has been both heartbreaking and illuminating in ways that no boardroom presentation or quarterly report could ever reveal about the character of those entrusted with carrying forward my father's vision of ethical business practices and respect for every human being who contributes to our success." Marcus Bradford's face drained of all color, as the magnitude of his that would be entirely justified by his own actions. The board members sat in various states of shock and recognition, some remembering stories about the founder's brilliant daughter who had earned her MBA from Harvard and worked successfully in investment banking before mysteriously disappearing from the corporate world, while others began connecting the dots between Margaret's insightful observations about business strategy and the legendary acumen of the Williams family bloodline. "I have spent these months watching how employees are treated based on their perceived status, listening to conversations that revealed true character when people believed no one important was present, and documenting a pattern of toxic leadership that has created a culture of fear, discrimination, and disrespect that would horrify my father if he were alive to witness what his company has become under certain individuals who have forgotten that true leadership means serving others rather than being served by them." Margaret Williams reached into the pocket of her simple cleaning uniform and withdrew a leather portfolio that none of the board members had ever seen her carry during her months of invisible service, and as she opened it with practiced efficiency, she revealed official documents bearing the seal of the corporate law firm that had handled Pinnacle Industries business since its inception, including stock certificates that clearly showed her ownership of 51% of the company's shares and a notarized letter from the Board of Trustees confirming her identity as the sole heir to founder Thomas Williams and her legal right to exercise complete control over all corporate decisions and personnel matters. Board Chairman Elizabeth Morrison leaned forward to examine the documents with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades verifying corporate credentials, and her solemn nod of confirmation sent shockwaves through the room as she validated what everyone was still struggling to believe, while Marcus Bradford felt his entire world collapsing around him like a house of cards caught in a hurricane of his own making. The man who had strutted through the halls of Pinnacle Industries like a conquering emperor now stood frozen in place as the terrible reality of his situation crashed over him in waves of mounting horror, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume that could no longer disguise the fact that he had just committed career suicide in front of the most powerful people in his industry. His carefully constructed image of sophisticated leadership crumbled completely as he realized that every cruel word he had spoken, every dismissive gesture he had made, and every act of professional bullying he had committed had been witnessed and documented by the one person who possessed absolute authority to end his career and destroy his reputation throughout the corporate world. The burgundy silk tie that had been his signature symbol of executive power now felt like a noose around his neck as he understood that his arrogant assumption of superiority had led him to attack and humiliate the woman who could have been his greatest ally, but instead had become the architect of his professional destruction. His hands began to tremble as the full implications of his actions became clear. Knowing that word of his behavior would spread throughout the business community like wildfire, ensuring that no respectable company would ever consider hiring someone who had publicly revealed such profound character flaws and fundamental lack of judgment, while his mind raced desperately through impossible scenarios for salvaging a career that he had just obliterated through his own prejudice, cruelty, and stunning inability to recognize true authority when it had been standing quietly in the same room with him for months. Margaret Williams straightened in the chair that was rightfully hers and spoke with the kind of decisive authority that comes from months of careful observation and moral certainty about the actions that justice demanded, her voice carrying across the boardroom with crystalline clarity as she delivered the verdict that Marcus Bradford had written for himself through his own choices and character. Marcus Bradford, you are immediately terminated as Chief Executive Officer of Pinnacle Industries, effective this moment, and your behavior today represents the culmination of a toxic leadership style that has poisoned this company's culture and betrayed every principle my father established when he built this organization on foundations of respect, integrity, and human dignity. The finality in her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. But before he could even attempt to mount a defense or plea for mercy, the boardroom doors opened to reveal Sarah Chen from accounting and David Martinez from IT support, followed by several other junior employees who had been drawn by the raised voices and now stood as witnesses to the corporate reckoning that was finally bringing justice to a workplace that had suffered under Marcus's regime of intimidation and discrimination. Margaret gestured for them to enter, recognizing the faces of the kind employees who had treated her with respect during her months of observation, and she invited them to share their own experiences with the board members who needed to understand the full scope of the cultural damage that had been inflicted under Marcus's leadership. Sarah Chen stepped forward with tears in her eyes but strength in her voice as she described the fear that had permeated the workplace, the way Marcus had created an environment where employees were afraid to speak up about problems or contribute ideas because they knew their efforts would be dismissed or ridiculed by a CEO who valued submission over innovation. David Martinez added his own testimony about witnessing Marcus's treatment of maintenance workers, security guards, and administrative staff, explaining how the toxic atmosphere had driven away talented people who could no longer tolerate working in an environment where their worth was measured solely by their position in an arbitrary hierarchy rather than their contributions and character. Margaret listened to each story with the compassion of someone who had witnessed these injustices firsthand, and she assured the assembled employees that fundamental changes would begin immediately to restore the respectful, inclusive culture that should define any organization worthy of the Williams family name. While Marcus stood in stunned silence as his former subordinates courageously spoke truth to the power he had abused for so long, Marcus Bradford's desperate attempts to salvage his crumbling career began with pathetic pleas for forgiveness and understanding, his voice cracking as he tried to convince the board members that his behavior had been an aberration caused by the stress of recent business challenges. But his words fell on deaf ears, as Margaret Williams had already begun the process of systematic transformation that would reshape Pinnacle Industries from the ground up. His frantic phone calls to influential contacts throughout the corporate world yielded nothing but uncomfortable silences and hurried excuses as news of his public humiliation spread through executive networks faster than he could attempt damage control, and within hours of his termination, headhunters were removing his name from their databases while his professional reputation disintegrated under the weight of eyewitness accounts from board members who had watched him reveal his true character in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Margaret moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent months planning for this moment, immediately convening emergency sessions with department heads to address the toxic policies and practices that had flourished under Marcus's leadership. And her first executive decisions included establishing an employee ombudsman program, implementing mandatory respect and inclusion training for all management personnel, and creating anonymous reporting systems that would allow workers to voice concerns without fear of retaliation from supervisors who might carry forward Marcus's legacy of intimidation and discrimination. She personally met with Sarah Chen, David Martinez, and the other courageous employees who had spoken up during the board meeting, promoting several of them to positions of greater responsibility and ensuring that their bravery in challenging the old system would be rewarded with opportunities to help build something better for future generations of Pinnacle Industries workers. The company's stock price actually rose in the days following Marcus's termination, as investors expressed confidence in Margaret's leadership and her commitment to creating a sustainable corporate culture based on merit and mutual respect rather than fear and arbitrary hierarchy. While Marcus watched his own financial portfolio collapse as his stock options became worthless and his severance package was reduced to the legal minimum, due to the circumstances of his dismissal. Within a week of the boardroom confrontation, Margaret had established new policies requiring all executives to spend time working alongside frontline employees to better understand the challenges they faced. And she instituted regular listening sessions where every worker, regardless of their position or title, could share ideas and concerns directly with senior leadership without fear of judgment or retaliation. 6 months after the boardroom confrontation that had forever changed the trajectory of Pinnacle Industries, Margaret Williams stood in the same executive hallway where she had once pushed her cleaning cart in deliberate anonymity. But now she moved through these spaces as the respected chief executive officer whose transformational leadership had restored the company's reputation and created a workplace culture that honored her father's original vision of dignity and opportunity for every employee, regardless of their position or background. The changes were visible everywhere. From the diverse group of newly promoted managers who had risen based on merit rather than politics, to the open-door policies that encouraged communication across all levels of the corporate hierarchy, and the employee satisfaction surveys that showed record levels of engagement and loyalty among workers who finally felt valued and heard by their leadership team. Sarah Chen now served as Vice President of Financial Strategy. Her insights about distribution partnerships having proven invaluable in the Southeast expansion that had exceeded all projections, while David Martinez had been promoted to Chief Technology Officer after implementing innovative systems that streamlined operations and improved workplace efficiency throughout the organization. In a small office building across town, Marcus Bradford sat at a modest desk in his new position as a junior consultant for a nonprofit organization focused on corporate ethics and workplace reform. His expensive suits replaced by simple business attire that reflected both his reduced circumstances and his growing understanding that true success could not be measured solely by material possessions or hierarchical power. The humbling experience of losing everything he had once considered important had forced Marcus to confront the ugly reality of his own character. And through months of soul-searching and community service, he had begun to develop genuine empathy for the people he had once dismissed as beneath his notice or concern. His work now involved helping other executives recognize and address toxic leadership behaviors, and he spoke regularly at management seminars about the devastating personal and professional consequences of allowing prejudice and arrogance to guide business decisions, always emphasizing that respect for others was not just a moral imperative, but a practical necessity for sustainable success. When he encountered janitors, security guards, and administrative staff in his new workplace, Marcus made a point of learning their names, asking about their families, and treating them with the same courtesy he showed to board members and senior executives, understanding finally that a person's worth could never be determined by their job title or the clothes they wore to work. The story of Margaret Williams and Marcus Bradford serves as a powerful reminder that true character is revealed not in moments of triumph and success, but in the quiet interactions when we believe no one important is watching, and that the way we treat those we perceive as having less power or status than ourselves becomes the ultimate measure of our own worth as human beings and leaders, in whatever sphere of influence we may occupy. Margaret's months of observation from behind the invisible barrier of a cleaning uniform demonstrated that wisdom, intelligence, and dignity exist in every corner of our workplaces and communities, often hidden beneath the surface of roles and appearances that our prejudiced assumptions lead us to dismiss without a second thought or genuine attempt at understanding. Marcus Bradford's spectacular downfall illustrates the devastating consequences that await those who build their sense of superiority on foundations of arrogance and discrimination, showing us that no amount of expensive clothing, impressive titles, or temporary authority can protect us from the ultimate accountability that comes when our true character is finally exposed to the light of justice and moral reckoning. The transformation of Pinnacle Industries under Margaret's leadership proves that positive change is always possible when we choose to value every person's contributions and treat each individual with the respect and dignity that should be the birthright of every human being, regardless of their job title, economic status, or the uniform they happen to wear during their daily work. If this story has touched your heart or reminded you of the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize the inherent worth of every person you encounter, We encourage you to share your own experiences of witnessing or overcoming workplace discrimination and prejudice in the comments below, because your stories have the power to inspire others and create ripple effects of positive change that can transform entire organizations and communities. Remember that each of us has the opportunity every single day to choose kindness over cruelty, respect over arrogance, and inclusion over discrimination. And these seemingly small choices accumulate over time to create either toxic environments that drive away talent and destroy lives, or flourishing communities where every person can contribute their unique gifts and abilities to collective success and human flourishing. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of courage, justice, and transformation that remind us of our shared humanity and the incredible power we all possess to make the world a more respectful and equitable place for everyone who crosses our path.